Wrong place to break down, old man. Someone sneered as Walt Jenkins struggled with his broken bicycle outside the roughest biker bar in town. Laughter echoed across the cracked parking lot. Phones were raised, filming his humiliation. But Walt, he kept his head down. He said nothing. He fought a different kind of battle, one of quiet pride and silent strength. In a world that seemed to move faster every year, Walter Walt Jenkins moved at his own pace. And on that quiet spring afternoon, it wasn't the roar of engines or the flashing screens that filled his world. It was the steady rhythm of his old Schwinn bicycle, creaking slightly under his careful guidance as he pedaled along the cracked sidewalks of Crestwood. Time had a different weight for Walt. Each mile was stitched with memories, the buzz of summer cicadas, the crisp smell of fall leaves, underfoot the heavy silence of winter mornings when the world held its breath. Crestwood wasn't much more than a few blocks of aging storefronts and picket fences in need of paint. But to Walt, it was a living map of a life well trodden. Every street corner, every weathered lamp post had a story he could still feel in his bones. At 72, Walt knew he had outlived many things: wars, friendships, dreams, even mistakes. Life had a way of sanding a man down until only the truest parts remained. For Walt, those parts were quiet pride, stubborn resilience, and a simple belief that a man's worth was measured not in noise but in how he carried himself when no one was looking. After the strokes had stolen his ability to drive, Walt had refused to surrender his independence. He didn't rage against it, he didn't complain. He simply adapted, just as he had once adapted to the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia decades ago. The bicycle had become his lifeline and his testament. 3 times a week, no matter the weather, Walt mounted that bike and made the 4-mile journey to Hartman's grocery on the edge of town. He learned to distribute the groceries just right. Heavier items on the bottom, fragile ones on top balanced carefully across the front basket, and the battered panniers strapped over the rear wheel. It was a small ritual, but one that gave him a sense of order, a sense of control in a world that sometimes felt like it was slipping away. That Tuesday had started like any other. The sun warmed his shoulders, and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecues. Walt's joints, rebellious some mornings, had decided to be merciful. His hands, though lined and knotted with time, gripped the handlebars with steady assurance. He had just passed the old brick library when he heard it, a sharp metallic ping that sliced through the soft hum of the afternoon. Walt's heart sank. He knew that sound too well. He eased the brakes gently, hoping he could coax the bicycle to a stop before disaster struck. But life, as Walt had learned, seldom offered that kind of courtesy. The chain snapped clean. The bicycle bucked under him, forcing him into a clumsy, skidding halt. He managed to stay upright barely, but the momentum carried him forward a few feet more, stopping him squarely in front of a place he would have preferred to avoid. The Rusted Horse, the toughest biker bar in Crestwood County. The kind of place where outsiders didn't linger, and old men on bicycles were about as welcome as rain at a 4th of July picnic. Walt didn't curse his luck, didn't shake his fist at the sky. He simply climbed off the bike with a quiet sigh and bent down to examine the damage. His fingers found the broken chain quickly, his body moving through the familiar motions of assessment, even as he felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle on him from the patio. Laughter drifted across the parking lot, low, sharp mocking. Still, Walt said nothing. He had faced worse than laughter, much worse. He knew deep in the core of him that sometimes the greatest battles a man fights aren't fought with fists or firepower. Sometimes they're fought alone with dignity against the slow, grinding erosion of time itself. And Walt Jenkins' battered bicycle and all was not about to surrender. Not today. Not here. Not ever. The air shifted the moment Walt dismounted. From the open patio of the Rusted Horse, the murmurs grew louder, taking on a sharper, meaner edge. Laughter that had started as a few scattered chuckles now rolled like distant thunder gathering strength. "Wrong place to break down, Grandpa," someone hollered, his voice dripping with amusement. A fresh wave of laughter followed, bouncing off the old brick walls and concrete pavement, bottles clinked, boots scuffed, the easy cruelty of a bored crowd looking for something or someone to mock. Walt didn't look up. He knelt slowly beside his bicycle, pulling the battered multi-tool from his pocket, a little piece of steel and stubbornness he had carried for years, his fingers stiff with age and weathered from work. Fumbled briefly before finding their rhythm, he began to work on the broken chain with the quiet patience of a man who had seen far worse than bruised pride. The afternoon sun pressed down, merciless and heavy. His old Marine Corps cap offered little shade, but Walt wore it like a shield. It wasn't just a cap, it was a part of him, stitched with memories most men could never understand. From across the lot, a younger biker raised his phone, aiming the camera straight at Walt. "Gonna go viral," he jeered to a chorus of snickering. Another voice chimed in, louder, meaner. "Bet that bike's seen more action than he has." Walt's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar betrayal of old injuries and time. He said nothing, not a word. He simply continued working the small clatter of metal on metal, the only sound he offered in return. Then, as if life decided to twist the knife, his bicycle tipped. The carefully balanced grocery bag spilled open, scattering cans and apples across the gritty pavement. The apples bounced and rolled, some coming to rest against the heavy boots of the bikers watching the show. The laughter exploded again, rougher this time, edged with mockery that cut deeper than any blade. Walt moved deliberately, gathering his scattered belongings, one piece at a time. He did not hurry, he did not flinch. He picked up each can, each battered apple, with the slow dignity of a man who refused to be hurried by humiliation. He had faced down worse than this. He had heard mortars fall and bullets sing. He had walked through days where death shadowed every step, and he had survived. A few of the bikers leaned back in their chairs, smirking, savoring the scene. A few shook their heads, amused by the stubborn old man who didn't seem to know when to quit. But somewhere beneath the noise and the jeering, something else was beginning to shift. A silence almost too soft to notice at first began to ripple through the crowd. Walt didn't hear the approaching footsteps at first, heavy deliberate boots crunching on loose gravel. When he did look up, his eyes met a figure stepping out of the bar's shadowed doorway. Dean Crusher Maddox, president of the Iron Vultures. A man whose name carried weight far beyond the county lines. 6'5" of muscle and authority, covered in tattoos that spoke of battles both on and off the battlefield. The patio fell deathly silent. Even the clinking of bottles stopped. Crusher didn't say a word at first. He simply surveyed the scene, the scattered groceries, the broken bicycle, the hunched figure of an old Marine picking up his fallen dignity one can at a time. His expression didn't change. His heavy boots crunched closer until he stood over Walt, casting a long shadow across the pavement. And then, in a voice that rumbled low but carried power, he spoke. "You coming, sir? No mockery, no laughter. Just a simple question offered with a respect that no one had expected." For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Walt, stiff and sore, straightened as much as his back would allow. He gathered the last of his groceries, tucked them into the battered basket, and without hesitation, he followed Crusher through the doors of the Rusted Horse. Behind them, the crowd of bikers sat frozen, the earlier laughter dying like smoke in the wind. Something was about to change, and deep down, even the rowdiest among them knew it. Crusher didn't bother to announce himself. He didn't need to. The bikers, still seated at battered wooden tables, watched as he rolled Walt's broken bicycle across the floor, the front wheel squeaking slightly. Without missing a beat, Crusher turned toward his club members, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Anyone with a toolkit and half a conscience, get over here now." It wasn't a request. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, one by one, men and women in leather vests and sun-faded denim rose from their seats, a quiet ripple of motion rolling through the room, heads bowed slightly, not from fear but from something older, deeper, a recognition almost ancestral of when the time for jokes had passed. Within minutes, the pool table in the center of the room was cleared, balls clattered into pockets, cue sticks. Abandoned Walt's battered Schwinn was lifted gently onto the felt, surrounded by a gathering storm of calloused hands and furrowed brows. The work began silent at first. A chain was fetched from somewhere out back. Someone rolled in a battered red toolbox. Another disappeared and returned with a pressure washer, blasting years of grime off the frame until the steel beneath gleamed like a metal polished for inspection. Walt stood to the side, groceries still clutched awkwardly to his chest, his heart thudding louder than any Harley parked outside. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't used to being seen anymore. And yet there they were, men and women half his age, some old enough to be his grandchildren, moving with the urgency and focus of a rescue mission. One of the younger bikers, a woman with a long braid tucked under a worn leather cap, knelt by the bike examining the frayed brake cables. "Amazing these haven't snapped already," she murmured, glancing up with something like admiration. Meanwhile, others argued over the best way to rethread the chain, to adjust the tension just right, to make the bike run smoother than it had in years. And Crusher, he didn't bark orders. He didn't boast. He simply worked alongside them, his massive hands deft and sure. The way a man handles something he understands too well. Old things worn by time, still worth saving. After nearly an hour, when the final bolt was tightened and the last smear of grease wiped away, Crusher disappeared into the back office. When he returned, he carried something folded with almost reverent care. It was a leather vest, brand new, yet somehow already heavy with meaning. He crossed the room in a few slow strides, standing once again before Walt. "We can't make you an iron vulture," Crusher said, his voice low but steady. "That's a patch you earn on the road, Hart." He paused, his gaze steady, the room silent except for the faint hum of the cooling fans overhead. "But we can honor the road you've already traveled." With that, he unfolded the vest. Across the back, above a soaring eagle stitched in deep silver thread, were two simple words. Respect earned. No flashy designs, no slogans. Just the kind of words that didn't need shouting to be heard. Crusher stepped forward and with surprising gentleness placed the vest across Walt's shoulders. It fit as if it had been waiting for him all along. The room exhaled. A few of the bikers looked away, clearing their throats, suddenly busy with imaginary tasks. Walt didn't cry. Men like him rarely did, but his hands, spotted and scarred by time, trembled slightly as they brushed the stitched letters across his back. It wasn't the leather that weighed on him. It was the understanding, the unspoken oath passed from one generation of warriors to the next. A silent promise. You are not forgotten. You are one of us. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had been sitting on that patio, would you have stayed silent? Would you have stepped up before Crusher did? Moments like these reveal who we truly are not. When it's easy, but when it's hard. Share your honest feelings in the comments below. What would you have done if you were standing there, beer in hand, watching that old Marine pick up his groceries alone? Let's talk about it. Your voice matters more than you know. When the repairs were finally done and the bicycle gleamed with a dignity it hadn't worn in decades, Crusher stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest. He turned to the gathered bikers, his voice steady, unmistakably firm. "Who's riding the sergeant home?" It wasn't a question. It was an order wrapped in respect. Every hand in the bar went up. Outside engines rumbled to life, their deep growl rising like a rolling wave. The iron vultures lined up on their bikes, forming two solemn columns down the cracked asphalt of Main Street. Walt, in his new leather vest bearing the stitched words, "Respect Earned," climbed onto his newly reborn bicycle. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like the fingers of time itself. And there in the center of a living honor guard, Walt Jenkins began his slow, steady ride home. The sight stopped traffic. Drivers pulled over and stepped out of their cars. Shopkeepers left their storefronts. Children paused mid-chase with their kites and stared wide-eyed. There were no loud cheers, no blaring horns, just a silent, reverent awe as the small town of Crestwood bore witness to something pure and rare, a tribute not to fame, not to fortune, but to character. Each push of Walt's foot on the pedal seemed to erase years from his frame. Each rumble of the Harleys behind him beat like a drum for the unseen battles he had fought, and the victory he now carried with quiet pride. Walt didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them there, the bikers who once laughed now riding in formation, behind him, a wall of steel and leather and unwavering respect. When they reached his modest apartment complex, a 2-story building with faded shutters and a garden stubbornly blooming against the odds, the vultures peeled off to either side, forming a living corridor. Walt dismounted slowly, his knees creaking, his hands firm on the handlebars. As he pushed the bike up the walkway, every biker he passed dipped their heads a silent salute that said more than 1,000 words could ever carry. Crusher approached one last time, pulling off his dark sunglasses. "You ever need anything at all," he said, voice low but fierce, "you come find us. You hear—" Walt knotted his throat, too thick for words. He placed a hand briefly on Crusher's broad shoulder, a gesture that spoke of shared battles, of burdens carried alone for too long, now finally recognized. "And if that bike gives you any trouble again," Crusher added, flashing a rare crooked grin, "you bring it straight to the Rusted Horse. We'll set it right." The bikers chuckled quietly, the sound rich, respectful, full of life. As the motorcycles rumbled back down the street, Walt stood alone on the sidewalk, the setting sun bathing him in gold. For a long time he didn't move. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the worn leather seat of his bicycle, the other tracing the bold stitched letters on the back of his new vest. Respect earned. It wasn't about the bicycle. It wasn't even about the vest. It was about the silent bond, one that stretched across wars, across generations, across time itself. It was about finally being seen, finally being honored, not for what he once was, but for the man he had quietly remained all along. The next morning, as the first light of dawn stretched across Crestwood, Walt Jenkins climbed back onto his bicycle. The familiar creaks and groans of the old Schwinn, now restored and gleaming, were like a comforting hymn. He pedaled slowly toward town, the cool morning air brushing against his face, the new vest warm against his shoulders. As he approached the Rusted Horse, he noticed something unusual. The bikers were already there, standing in a small, quiet group by the entrance, tools tucked away, beers, untouched, eyes steady. And beside the battered brick wall, freshly installed and gleaming under the morning sun, was a brass plaque, simple, solid, eternal. It read, "Here honor is earned and remembered." Walt stopped his bicycle, letting his foot touch the ground. For a long moment he simply stared at the plaque, feeling its weight settle into his chest, not as a burden, but as a blessing. He didn't need anyone to explain it. He understood. It wasn't just about him. It was about every man and woman who had fought battles, unseen, born scars, invisible to the world, and kept marching forward without fanfare. It was a marker for every forgotten story, every silent victory. Walt tipped his cap slightly toward the bikers, a gesture of acknowledgement of gratitude, and continued on his way. From that day forward, every time Walt pedaled past the Rusted Horse, a ritual unfolded. The engines would go silent. Conversations would pause. Helmets would be lifted. Heads would bow. No orders given. No ceremonies announced. Just a shared, unspoken understanding that some lives deserved to be honored simply because they were lived with quiet courage and unyielding dignity. Over time, the town of Crestwood changed in small but powerful ways. Younger bikers, once quick to judge, now nodded with respect when an elder passed. Kids playing in the streets learned to pause and wave when they saw Walt's figure, coasting by upright and proud. And Walt himself, he rode a little straighter, a little lighter, not because he had sought recognition, but because recognition had found him in the most unexpected of places. Not in medals, not in parades, but in the silent nods of rough-handed strangers and the burnished letters on a plaque that would outlive them all. Life hadn't made Walt Jenkins rich, it hadn't made him famous, but it had made him something far rarer, a man respected not for the battles he fought, but for the quiet way he chose to live afterward. And in the heart of a small town called Crestwood, that was more than enough. I'm James, and I'm proud to say I'm a veteran too. Today I had the honor of sharing Walt's story with you, a story that reminds us that real respect isn't bought, and it isn't begged for. It's lived, it's earned, and sometimes it's quietly recognized by those who still remember what matters. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did this story stir up in you? Have you ever witnessed a moment when honor spoke louder than words? Share your feelings in the comments below. I truly believe the more we talk about these moments, the more we keep them alive. If you found meaning here today, please tap that like button. It tells me you want more stories like this. And if you feel at home in the spirit of brotherhood and dignity, consider subscribing to the channel. We're just getting started. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Stay strong, stay true, and remember, honor once earned never fades.